So I left you in the last video with a question of what this picture of two competing elites really means for this idea of neo-proprietarianism, or this sort of inequality regime that's characterized as neo-proprietarianism. Well, I'm going to read an excerpt from Capital and Ideology to try and fill in some of this picture. So here is the book. As I said, it's gigantic. But I'm going to read you an excerpt starting on page 709. So, the neo-proprietarianism that has emerged over the past several decades is a complex phenomenon. It is not merely a return to the proprietarianism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In particular, it is linked to an extreme form of meritocratic ideology. Meritocratic discourse generally glorifies the winners in the economic system, while stigmatizing the losers for their supposed lack of merit, virtue, and diligence. Of course, meritocracy is an old ideology on which elites in all times and places have always relied in one way or another to justify their dominance. Over time, however, it has become increasingly common to blame the poor for their poverty, and this is one of the principal distinctive features of today's inequality regime. But it was above all when the era of higher education began that meritocratic ideology assumed its full proportions. So again, we're kind of starting from this idea of, yes, we've got this kind of ideology of meritocracy, but this really took hold in the expansion of higher education. So we can kind of see the potential links, at least, of this sort of emergence of a competing elite, educated on the one hand, and if the educated, or if part of that is sort of evolution goes hand in hand with this sort of increasing meritocratic ideology, we might sort of see, or at least have hypotheses about the nature of that relationship and how it interacts with ideas of redistribution. So Piketty goes on, but I kind of wanted to end with this idea. So how this idea of meritocracy really fits in with ideas of inequality, where the goal is usually to justify existing inequalities with no consideration of the sometimes glaring failures of the existing system, or the fact that lower and middle class students do not have access to the same resources or courses as the children of the upper classes. So again, kind of thinking about how we justify inequalities, how meritocracy plays into that justification. We can think about justifications of inequality. I have what I have because I've worked for it. I've worked hard, I've studied hard, I've made the right investments. And it's this sort of idea of meritocracy and how that fits in with kind of this primacy of private property that Piketty says is important for understanding the inequality regime of today. So let's have a little look at some evidence on social position and ideas and beliefs of meritocracy. So we're sort of seeing if this idea of meritocracy, particularly as we move up the sort of social position scale, see if there is really any correlation between these two things. So just go back to your own responses to the question that I posed in the 3-minute task and think about your own position in society. So, you are students on one of the most prestigious courses in one of the top universities in the UK. Do you think your own position is fairly and justly determined? Well, sort of evidence that is coming out of psychology suggests that the higher social positions can be psychologically distressing if we believe they are indeed unfairly or unjustly determined. So if we actually occupy one of these higher social positions, if we can't internally justify them, this causes some kind of psychological distress. And as humans, we often want to avoid these kind of feelings of distress. So it wouldn't be too far a stretch to at least expect that as our positions increase in society, so too will our tendencies to endorse a kind of merit-based explanation of economic inequality and privilege. And this is really what some of the experimental evidence is suggesting. So I've pointed out a study here by Brown, Iannuzzi and colleagues. These papers aren't actually on the reading list, but if you're interested in looking at them in more detail, just let me know and I can point you to the full references. But this study, it provides an experimental demonstration of this sort of ideological justification process. So in this particular experiment, and I'll give you a short rundown of the details, well, participants were performing tasks and they were given feedback on their performance. So they were informed whether they are high performing or low performing. And what the results suggest is that on receiving this information, they were then asked to indicate their support for a system of redistribution that would redirect earnings from the top players to those at the bottom as a form of a form of credit, essentially. Compared with participants who had learned that they were low ranking, those who were informed that they were high ranking were less supportive of redistribution, more likely to view the game as fair, and more likely to view society more generally as open and meritocratic. So it seemed that sort of people who were told that they were high performers seemed to sort of see the system as open and meritocratic. So it's confirming this idea that the higher up in the social system you are, the sort of more likely you are to endorse this kind of meritocratic ideology. But the rub here in this particular experiment is that all participants were actually randomly assigned whether they were high or low performing. So the information that they were given about their performance had nothing to do with the way that they actually carried out the tasks. So there's nothing in there inherently to suggest that these folks should deem their performance sort of more worthy or not. That was a random, they were randomly assigned. But it does seem to suggest that kind of if you have confirmation that you are a high performer, you tend, at least in this experimental setting, you tend to at least endorse this idea of meritocracy. So we have some other evidence here as well, and it looked at agreement with statements such as, "I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than others." And this research found that those who rated themselves higher in social class, so this was kind of a self-reporting of their own social position, but those who rated themselves as higher in social class, as well as those folks whose parents were more highly educated, tended to more strongly agree with statements like that. And then these increased feelings of kind of entitlement, I suppose, also led wealthier individuals to be more reactive to perceived unfairness when these folks feel like they're getting a deal that's less than they deserve. So when they're faced with inequalities that affects them, they tend to be sort of more reactive. So they're more likely to reject deals, more likely to react offers when they feel that they're getting less than they actually deserve. So this kind of idea of deservingness plays into social position as well, or at least there seems to be some relationship between social position and feelings of entitlement or deservingness. So what does this all mean? Again, linking it back to the sort of this two competing elites, and particularly the sort of the education elite. Well, I think most of us can probably see ourselves as progressives when it comes to inequality. So, we see problems with the current economic system and support the ideas of redistribution in theory. But when it comes down to it, we can quite easily rationalise why we have the positions in the society that we do. And I mean, again, this is perhaps just a little thought experiment for yourselves. Think about this idea. Inheritance tax is a prime example of this. So, when we think about what is an optimal inheritance tax and what is our justification for it, we might find ourselves being more in line with the kind of meritocratic argument than we would like to perhaps admit. And so, in societies like ours in Britain, we've got pretty low social mobility. So if we are indeed kind of committed to redistribution, we should probably support very high rates of inheritance tax. But there's something sort of internally stopping us, or potentially our parents. They're not so ready to give up their capital to the taxman. So we don't really follow through on these ideas. Maybe we think that we've earned it and have the right to pass it on to our children. So this ideology of meritocracy and deservingness feeds into these debates, probably explicitly and perhaps a little bit implicitly. So again, perhaps take some time to think about your own thinking on that question and really try and grapple with why and how you think about these things. And here I wanted to introduce another idea which again ties in this link between education and ideas of meritocracy, or at least ideas around redistribution. But this time we're looking at potential causal mechanism. And this is a nice recent paper that is actually written by a friend of mine, and so I wanted to share it with you. So it sets out, both a theoretical mechanism, and it does include a bit of an empirical test of what effect a university education might have on our support for redistribution. Now again, kind of place yourselves in the context of these findings and what we might expect to see. So what we have to start with is the sort of standard economic type of explanation. So a university education usually means that we earn more, so we might have private economic interests in less redistribution. But of course there's much more to a university education than just getting you prepared for earning a good wage in the job market. We hope at least that a university education fosters ideas as well. So how does it foster these ideas? Well, both in a kind of top-down way as a result of what you're taught and what you learn, but because it constitutes what the paper calls a locus of socialization. So you can think about kind of how you are socialized as a university student. To take a pretty optimistic view, we might think that through both of these, I'm going to call them ideational mechanisms, so mechanisms that are characterized by ideas, education is expected to foster norms of cultural inclusion, openness, because I suppose through a university education we meet lots of different people, we're exposed to people and ideas from different walks of life. So perhaps these inclusive ideas might be associated with support for redistribution, sort of tempering this pure economic interest effect. But to take a more critical view, perhaps both kind of top-down and bottom-up processes are characterised by conservative rather than progressive ideational forces. And again, think about your own experience here. To what extent do you think the ideas that you've been taught in lectures really preserve or challenge the status quo? So, I mean, think about the economics teaching that you've done in the last couple of years. What type of economics have you kind of learned up to now? I'm not sure that you will have been exposed to much heterodox stuff, for instance. So are these ideas actually really challenging the status quo, or are they reinforcing a pretty conservative sort of set of intellectual ideas? And again, thinking about your own experience, the kind of people that you hang out with, do you think that you are really exposed to difference? So, I appreciate that the academic community is certainly international. I do wonder whether sort of elite higher education at least sort of highlights this concentration of privilege. And this is really the proposition presented in the paper. But on the face of it, the effects of support for redistribution could go in either direction. So we're kind of agnostic at this stage, at least at the theoretical level. So it kind of depends on the nature of these top-down and bottom-up mechanisms, which way we might see the distribution effect going. It could be positive, it could be negative. So let's kind of see what the data tells us. So the verdict here is that a university education through sort of economic security and I suppose a kind of intellectual sophistication, it doesn't seem to encourage this sort of multiculturalism and inclusion, but on the non-economic issue dimension. But kind of when we're thinking about the ideational processes within education, these seem to be combining with the material private benefit aspect of education to create a strong conservative force when it comes to redistribution. So kind of upholding some kind of skepticism of redistribution. What might explain this? Well, this could be the kind of top-down side of things through sort of economically conservative ideas that are taught, or sort of, I guess more generally, the sort of institutionalization of an individualistic culture of education, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end about that. But I think they could also be bottom-up, so the overrepresentation of folks with affluence, at least relative to the amount of those people that we find in the general population. So on the whole, we're sort of seeing that a university education actually kind of stifles this idea of solidarity, and we have skepticism of redistribution. But the mechanisms through which this is operating, it could be primarily a top-down, it could be primarily the bottom-up, but it's likely to be sort of mutually reinforcing effect between these two processes. Right, so we've covered quite a lot of ideas already, and I appreciate this is a bit of a kind of dump of things running around in my head, but I do think all of these things are connected, and I want to at least provide a few prompts for things that you might want to go off and research further for yourselves. But let's get back to the main topic of inequality and redistribution. We've seen that the result of post-war trends is that Western democracies are now dominated by these two rival elites, so reflected in many two-party electoral systems: a wealthy elite, what Piketty calls a merchant right, and an educational elite, or what Piketty calls the Brahmin left. But really important to Piketty's ideas is that both of these elite groups are thought of as winners from today's globalised transnationalism and what he calls the hyper-capitalist system. So both of these groups assume or at least accept the primacy of competitive markets and can justify their outcomes as the workings of this kind of meritocratic system. So Piketty would argue that it is this shared ideology of meritocracy that justifies today's inequality, and this is sort of a product of market forces operating on a presumed starting point of equal opportunity, and however fictional that might be. But kind of if we are competing on these lines, and both of these elite groups have something to gain from the sort of prevailing system, it's not too difficult to see that political competition based on redistribution is effectively ruled out. So if winners of the existing game have other things, other interests that they want to pursue, redistribution goes out the window. It's effectively off the table. And I suppose we can think about this intuitively, and it is what we've seen, at least in the UK and perhaps the US, in terms of the left. So, when Labour put forward Jeremy Corbyn and likewise Bernie Sanders, so the more sort of radical left in the old sort of traditional sense of the word. So leaders who definitely do have an interest in inequality and perhaps have muted views on internationalization. So, skepticism around globalization, or skepticism around Brexit, for instance. Their campaigns ultimately weren't very successful, and now we both have in the Labour Party in the UK and the Democrats in the US two leaders who have kind of gone back to that pro-market stance, but with a more globalist, socially and culturally progressive platform, and we can see that in both Keir Starmer and, of course, Joe Biden. But as Piketty writes, if redistribution between the rich and the poor is ruled out, or competition on the economic dimension is ruled out, then it is all but inevitable that political conflict will focus on the cultural dimension, an area in which nation states are still free to act, namely defining and controlling their borders. And so in many democracies, what we've seen is a political landscape that really sets a pro-market party that claims to defend nationalist sort of interests against a pro-market party that embraces the image of diversity and cosmopolitanism. So to the half of the population that has known only kind of stagnant incomes and increasing economic insecurity, I guess one party offers sort of a modestly more beneficial economic policy sort of bestowed by a technocratic elite, and the other promises to sort of restore faded glory by winning trade wars and getting rid of immigrants. And obviously these folks are obviously quite effectively courted by the populist radical right too. But turning back to the topic, when these kind of cultural cleavages become more salient, I guess this also creates more space for identity-based politics to kick in. And might also explain why it seems that voting is perhaps, I'm not going to say no longer about issues at all, but perhaps is a kind of tapping into the identities of people, and be people who are voting for the party that best represents their identity and values, whether their policies are in line with their interests or not. So yeah, kind of like this kind of salience of cultural cleavages makes way for identity politics. So thinking about issues from last week, let's think about what that means for the issue of inequality and redistribution. And so I've put another reading from Larry Bartels on the reading list as well, and it's called Homer Gets a Tax Cut. And Well, it's not sort of explicitly linked to these particular ideas, but I think it covers many of them that I've been talking about. And the main finding is that the Bush tax cuts were supported by many people who would in reality seriously lose out from it. But these folks often expressed support for the tax cut because they identified with the Republican Party. But also, I think really interesting, they tended to sort of support this policy when they were reminded of their own tax burdens. So it didn't matter that kind of the tax or the proposed tax cut for the rich had nothing to do with their own tax burden. This would be a tax cut for the rich. But they tended to sort of support this tax cut when they were reminded about their own tax burden. So how might this play into this kind of ideology of meritocracy or this ideology of neo-proprietarianism that Piketty talks about? Well, I guess that Piketty might explain this as a kind of reflection of the prevailing neo-proprietarian ideology that, taxes are essentially bad. And when we think about taxes, we associate negatively with them, kind of ideationally speaking. So there are a number of ways in which this sort of emergence of a competing elite might play into the narratives that justify today's inequality. These elites have other things to worry about other than redistribution, so redistribution effectively gets sidelined in political debates. This kind of creates cleavages, or at least makes salient the more cultural cleavages, which makes people think less about the issues and perhaps more about their own identity. And then perhaps there is some kind of reflexiveness in this ideology that actually translates to people, who might otherwise have interests in redistribution. And so you can kind of see how this sort of meritocratic ideology or neo-proprietarian ideology even plays into the views and perceptions of the folks at the lower end of the redistribution scale. So people, who have got low incomes who actually don't support redistribution. Perhaps it's because this sort of the reflexivity of this narrative in sort of, taxes are bad. And there are, of course, lots of other factors that go in to explain why and how we're influenced by ideas. But because you've been exposed to ideas in public choice as part of this module, I thought I'd introduce you to some of the leading characters in public choice to consider the influence they have had on the prevailing, what I'm calling, universe of political discourse, so to speak. So the film that's playing in the background here is called The Trap, and it's a documentary by a filmmaker, a BBC filmmaker called Adam Curtis. Now, some of his films are a bit conspiracy theorist, but they're always beautiful and have some provocative ideas in them. I've actually put a link to one of his films on the reading list because in it he talks about the influence of public choice on the way we all think about things, political, economic, as well as the everyday. Now I'm going to play, or I'm going to share with you a recording from a lecture that I gave last year. This is a bit of an interlude on the history of public choice, so feel free to skip this, but I think it's pretty interesting if you have the time. Where it all starts. So I have here the Rand Corporation bomb damage effect computer. Anybody heard of the Rand Corporation? Joaquin?
It's the cockroach, right?
Say?
It's a cockroach, right? A cockroach like the Americans.
So it's kind of this centre, I suppose, where academics converged who were, brilliant in their own way, working at universities, academic institutions, but it was really sort of a place that would strategize on how the US could deal with the Russians in the Cold War situation. And so they were kind of developing all types of systems, all types of theories for how they might win the Cold War, essentially. And John Nash was one of those folks. He, along with Schelling, kind of the masters of game theory, were both part of the Rand Corporation, and this is where kind of the ideas that underpin game theory really were developed. And so sort of the idea or the importance of this is that the way that the game theory or kind of the theories used in the Cold War situation were really about distrust, strategizing, so thinking about,
you know, what is my best response to this person's, given that we are competing. Always being suspicious of the other player, always being kind of motivated by your own self-interest, but also fundamentally it's kind of this idea that if people are free to choose their own strategies, this does not necessarily descend into chaos. So kind of this Nash equilibrium type concept speaks to the idea that, you know, given the opportunity, rational decision makers will come to the solution that is not totally disastrous or annihilation through nuclear war. So kind of the Nash equilibrium in the Cold War case is that both sides arm to the hilt. You know, the best option would be no one arms, and we can agree that we won't arm ourselves. But kind of the Nash concept says that, you know, there's always going to be an incentive to deviate. The best response of one party to the other is to arm. So kind of this Nash equilibrium state of affairs, given that we are suspicious of each other, given that we don't have trust, given that we are individually kind of out to pursue our own national interests, we kind of get to this position that we both arm, but, you know, that ultimately saves the world from nuclear disaster. So whilst these sort of principles are applied to the Cold War and nuclear strategy, those principles were applied to society more generally. And so this is kind of taken as a possible way that individuals would make decisions outside in society. And so that's what Nash really did, along with Schelling and others. Then came along James Buchanan. Let's say he's the father of public choice. He thought, yeah, I like this idea, and I hate government. So, you know, if we think that all individuals are self-interested in the sense of maximising their own utility, like there can't be such thing necessarily as public value. And public servants, governments, officials, they're all individuals. And so these folks must also be driven and motivated by these kind of selfish interests. So there is no such thing as public value, public purpose. We'll talk a little bit about that next time when we do public goods. But he would say, you know, we just need to give incentives to public officials in order to maximise their own utilities. And so we want to get rid of those people who think they've got public value because they're probably the ones who are going to extract the most rents. They're the problematic people. So we want people who can be incentivised given our assumptions about human nature. James Buchanan was quite influential on the scene, and I think he represents public choice, but he's probably just a kind of a symbol of the zeitgeist at the time. Visited Margaret Thatcher. There she is, dancing with Reagan, but hugely influential on the kind of the economic ideology of the time and the kind of policies that were being put in place. And these changes in the way of kind of people not necessarily being told what to do by government, or this idea that we should be told what to do by government, but actually we are given individual freedom to make our own decisions because we are all motivated by individual individual approaches, individual actions in order to achieve these given objectives. And so, yeah, this was kind of influential on Maggie Thatcher's economic policy and kind of way of doing things, which then also fed into that of Blair and Bill Clinton there on the right-hand side. So this idea that, you know, governments, public servants aren't motivated by altruistic but kind of sociotropic goals. And what we need to do to make government more efficient is appeal to those incentives that are that kind of underpin all of human nature. And so the kind of idea around targets and things like that, you know, hospitals given targets, teachers given targets, and if they're given these targets, they can, you know, choose individually. They have the freedom to choose how they want to actually achieve them, but they will choose the most efficient way. So kind of efficiency is almost a byproduct of their individual approaches to solving the issues or kind of meeting their specific targets. I guess the kind of structural argument is that this way of thinking about things is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that, you know, there's a reflexive type feedback mechanism going on here. So the more you tell people that this is how humans behave, the more they end up behaving like that version of human. And I don't know, I don't know if this would be any different to when I was an economics student, but what was really interesting in last week's seminar is that every single group, bar one, chose or kind of motivated their arguments on how people vote, or kind of, yeah, what kind of policy platforms politicians would take in the rational choice paradigm. So I don't know, I can't say this is very anecdotal, but the fact that you are kind of trained in economics to some extent might sort of speak to this reflexive nature of the way that we're taught. We're just being told that this is a model of human nature. Actually, we kind of embody it in spirit. And this could be a problem when we're thinking about ourselves as individuals in society. And this ultimately could have pernicious impacts on our preferences for redistribution if we think that inequality is necessarily unfair.